It begins like a hallucination. There are no instruments, just voices, layered, spectral, hanging in the air like smoke. It doesn't sound like a rock song. It doesn't sound like a pop song. It sounds like a question posed by a choir standing at the gates of heaven, or perhaps hell. Then, the piano enters. For the next 5 minutes and 55 seconds, the listener is dragged through a sonic funhouse. It starts as a fragile ballad about a murderer confessing to his mother. Then, without warning, it swerves into an Italian operatic nightmare, full of shrieking falsettos, thunderbolts, and characters from 17th century commedia dell'arte. And finally, it explodes into a hard rock headbanger riff before dissolving back into a whisper and a gong crash. There is no chorus. The title never appears in the lyrics. It contains words, Scaramouche, Galileo, Beelzebub, Bismillah, that had never been uttered on Top 40 radio before, and likely never have since. By every conceivable metric of the music industry in 1975, Bohemian Rhapsody was not a hit song. It was a suicide note. The conventional wisdom of the era was rigid. A hit single had a formula. It needed a hook within the first 30 seconds. It needed a sing-along chorus that repeated at least 3 times. And, crucially, it needed to be under 3.5 minutes long. Radio DJs, the gatekeepers of culture, would not play anything longer. They needed time for commercials, news breaks, and their own voices. When Queen presented this 6-minute operatic monstrosity to their record label, EMI, the reaction was unified panic. The executives told the band's manager, John Reed, that if they released this song, they would be the laughingstock of the industry. They said it was self-indulgent. They said it was incomprehensible. They said flatly that it would never, ever be played on the radio. They wanted the band to cut it. They suggested chopping out the opera section. They suggested releasing a radio edit, but the band refused. Specifically, one man refused. This is the story of a song that shouldn't exist. It is the story of the most expensive, complicated, and maddening recording session in the history of British rock up to that point. It is a detective story trying to decode lyrics that the author took to his grave. But mostly, it is the story of Freddie Mercury, a man who looked at the rigid rules of pop music, smiled a wicked smile, and decided to break every single one of them in 6 minutes of glorious, defiant madness. EMI said it was too long. The critics said it was pretentious. The public? The public heard it, and their heads exploded. To understand how a musical anomaly like Bohemian Rhapsody gets dragged into existence, you first have to understand that it was not written in the conventional sense of rock and roll. Most rock songs in the 1970s were born from jams. A guitarist would hit a cool riff in a garage. The drummer would fall in. The singer would improvise some lyrics, and a song would emerge from the collective sweat of the room. It was an organic, physical process. Bohemian Rhapsody was different. It was not born in a garage. It was not a jam. It was a cathedral that was built, brick by imaginary brick, entirely inside the mind of Farrokh Bulsara, the man the world had come to know as Freddie Mercury. But to understand the pressure behind this creation, we have to look at where Queen stood in 1975. To the outside world, they were rock stars. They had hits like Killer Queen. They appeared on Top of the Pops. They wore satin and pearls. But behind the glamour, they were in a state of catastrophic crisis. They were victims of one of the worst management deals in music history. Despite selling millions of records, the band members were essentially broke. They were living on a paltry weekly allowance. Roger Taylor was told not to hit the drums too hard because they couldn't afford new sticks. Freddie Mercury couldn't afford curtains for his apartment. They had just broken free from their management, but they were left with a massive debt and a terrifying ultimatum. Their next album, A Night at the Opera, had to be a masterpiece. If it failed, Queen would be bankrupt and broken up. It was under this crushing weight, the weight of debt, ambition, and the desperate need to prove themselves, that Freddie Mercury's creativity crystallized into something manic and unprecedented. The seeds of the song had been germinating in his subconscious for years, dating back to his days as an art student at Ealing Art College in the late 60s. Friends remembered him playing a crude version of the opening melody on an upright piano, calling it the cowboy song, because of the Western-style opening line, "Mama just killed a man." But by the summer of 1975, these scattered fragments were coalescing into a grand, terrifying design. Freddie did not write music like a classical composer. He didn't sit down with neat sheets of staff paper and write out parts for cello or timpani. His method was one of disciplined chaos. He was a hoarder of melodies. He carried around notebooks, scraps of paper, napkins, and, most famously, telephone directories. Whenever an idea hit him, he would scribble it down in a shorthand code that only he understood. A melody line here, a lyric fragment there. He would use the A to Z London phone book, writing complex chord changes over the names and numbers of local plumbers and electricians. To anyone else who looked at these pages, they looked like the ramblings of a madman. It was a Mongolian clusterfuck of notes, as one producer later described it. But to Freddie, they were the blueprint for a sonic skyscraper. He didn't just hear the melody. He heard the finished record in his head. He could mentally hear the harmonies, the texture of the guitar, the specific decay of the cymbals. The challenge was communicating this internal symphony to the other three people in the room. Queen was a famously democratic band. They were four alpha males, all of whom wrote hits. Brian May wrote the anthemic rockers. John Deacon wrote the polished pop hooks. Roger Taylor wrote the gritty, car-focused tracks. They fought over track listings like politicians. But when Freddie brought Bohemian Rhapsody to them, the democracy was temporarily suspended. This was not a collaboration. This was a dictatorship of vision. Brian May later recalled the specific moment Freddie unveiled the monster. They were in the studio, and Freddie sat down at the piano. He played the beautiful, haunting ballad section. The band nodded. It was gorgeous. It sounded like a hit. Then he played the heavy rock riff. They nodded again. That was their wheelhouse, the kind of Led Zeppelin-esque stomp they excelled at. But then, Freddie stopped playing. He turned to the band, his fingers hovering over the keys, and with a mischievous, almost wicked glint in his eye, he said, "Now, dears, this is where the opera section comes in." The band stared at him. Opera? They were a rock band. They played loud guitars. They wore denim and leather and occasionally satin. They didn't know anything about opera. They didn't know a mezzo-soprano from a pepperoni pizza. Roger Taylor, the drummer with the rock and roll heart, was particularly skeptical. He thought Freddie was taking the theatrical thing too far. He worried they would alienate their hard rock fan base. Fred's thing, as they called it, seemed like a bridge too far. But the thing about Freddie Mercury was that his conviction was absolute. He didn't offer the song as a suggestion. He presented it as a fact. The man tasked with translating this impossible vision onto magnetic tape was their producer, Roy Thomas Baker. Baker was a brilliant, eccentric workaholic who loved pushing the boundaries of the studio as much as the band did. Baker vividly remembers the first time he heard the song. He went to Freddie's apartment in Kensington for dinner. After the meal, Freddie led him to the piano. Freddie played the intro. "That's good," Baker thought. Then Freddie stopped. "And this is where the opera section comes in," he said. Then he played a bit more, pounding the keys. Then he stopped again. "And this is where the rock section comes in." Then he stopped again. "And this is the outro." Baker sat there, sipping his coffee, trying to process the disjointed, wild, and completely uncommercial mess he was hearing. It wasn't a song, it was a collage. But as he watched Freddie's hands fly across the keys, he realized something crucial. Freddie wasn't guessing. He wasn't hoping it would work. He knew. Baker looked at the pile of phone book pages covered in scribbles. He looked at the intense, wide-eyed young man at the piano who was gambling his entire career on a song about a clown named Scaramouche. And Roy Thomas Baker made a decision that would change the course of music history. He didn't say, "That's too long." He didn't say, "That's crazy." He didn't say, "Let's simplify it." He smiled and said, "Let's do it." They had the architect. They had the blueprint. Now they just needed to build the thing. And nobody involved, not Freddie, not the band, and certainly not the producer, had any idea that the construction process would nearly drive them all insane. In August 1975, Queen packed their equipment and drove west, out of London, across the border into Wales. They arrived at Rockfield Studios, a converted farmhouse in the middle of the Monmouthshire countryside. It was an incongruous setting for an opera. Outside there were cows, tractors, and rain. Inside, there was a revolution taking place. To understand the sheer madness of recording Bohemian Rhapsody, you have to understand the technological cage the band was working in. Today, a teenager with a laptop has unlimited audio tracks. They can layer 1,000,000 voices if they want to. In 1975, the absolute limit of high-end technology was 24-track analog tape. That means you had 24 lanes on the highway. Once those lanes were full, you couldn't add anything else without deleting something. For a normal rock band, drums, bass, guitar, vocals, 24 tracks was a luxury. But Freddie Mercury didn't want a rock band. He wanted a choir. He wanted the Mormon Tabernacle Choir, but he wanted them to sound like they were on nitrous oxide. The problem was the math. There were only 4 people in the band. John Deacon, the bassist, famously did not sing. That left 3 voices: Freddie Mercury, Brian May, and Roger Taylor. So how do you turn 3 Englishmen into a celestial choir of 200 voices using only 24 tracks of tape? You cheat. You use a technique called bouncing. The process was excruciatingly tedious and incredibly risky. The 3 singers would gather around a single microphone. Freddie would conduct them. They would sing a 3-part harmony. Then, they would rewind the tape. They would sing the same part again, doubling it to make it thicker. They would do this until 4 or 5 tracks were filled with vocals. Then came the dangerous part. They would take those 5 tracks and mix them down, or bounce them, onto a single fresh track. This freed up the original 5 tracks to be used again. But there was a catch. Once you bounced the tracks down, they were locked forever. You couldn't go back and turn up Roger's voice or turn down Brian's. If the mix wasn't perfect, you had to scrub it and start all over again. It was destructive editing. They built the song layer by layer, like a sonic lasagna. They did this over and over, stacking harmonies on top of harmonies. The opera section became a test of physical and mental endurance. For 3 weeks, they did nothing but sing. They worked 12-hour days, singing Magnifico O until their throats were raw and their brains were melting. The chemistry of their voices was crucial. Brian May had a low, warm warmth to his voice. Roger Taylor had a high, raspy, dog whistle scream. Freddie had a sharp, crystal-clear attack. When combined, they created a strange, metallic bell effect that no other band could replicate. Freddie was a demanding taskmaster. He would arrive at the studio every morning, fresh and energized, with new scraps of paper. "I've added a few more Galileos, dears," he would announce to the groaning band. The Galileo sequence is legendary. Freddie wanted Roger Taylor to sound like a panic-stricken astronomer. He kept pushing him higher. "Higher, Roger!" Freddie would shout from the control room. Roger would squeeze his eyes shut and scream a high B-flat falsetto. "Not high enough, darling! Again!" The famous Galileo screams you hear on the record are the sound of a drummer being pushed to the absolute limit of human physiology. But as the days turned into weeks, a new, terrifying problem emerged. The physical medium itself began to fail. Analog tape is made of plastic coated with magnetic oxide dust. Every time the tape head passes over the tape to play or record, it shaves off a microscopic layer of that dust. Because Queen was running the tape back and forth thousands of times to add the 180 vocal overdubs, the tape began to disintegrate. Brian May recalls a moment of horror when they held the master tape up to the light. It was translucent. The oxide had worn off so severely that you could see through it. The music was literally vanishing. Producer Roy Thomas Baker famously joked that they were holding the song together with sellotape. The studio engineers had to hurriedly make a safety copy of the tape because they were genuinely terrified that one more pass would snap the master, and weeks of work would end up in a pile of plastic spaghetti on the floor. Finally, the opera was done. The tape held, but the song wasn't finished. After the claustrophobia of the opera section, the band needed a release. They needed to remind the world that they were, in fact, a hard rock band. Brian May picked up the Red Special, the guitar he had built with his father, out of an old fireplace mantle and knitting needles. He plugged it into a Vox AC30 amplifier. He turned everything up to 10. When the opera section dissolves into that angry, stomping guitar riff, it is a moment of pure catharsis. It is the sound of the band breaking out of the asylum. It grounded the song back in reality. It gave the listener permission to headbang after 5 minutes of confusion. Finally, the pieces were assembled. The ballad, the opera, the rock, and the mournful outro were stitched together. Roy Thomas Baker sat at the mixing desk. In 1975, there was no computer automation. Mixing was a performance. Baker and the band members had to stand at the console, each man controlling a group of faders, moving them up and down in real time as the song played. It was a choreographed dance of fingers. When they finally played the finished track back, from the first "Is This the Real Life?" to the final gong crash, the silence in the room was heavy. They had done it. They had built the impossible object. It was 5 minutes and 55 seconds of madness. It was weird. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. And now they had to convince the men in suits that the world was ready to listen to it. The master tape was finished. The impossible object existed. But now, the band faced a foe far more stubborn than analog tape or vocal cords: the music business. The battle lines were drawn in the plush, cigar smoke-filled offices of EMI Records in London. On one side sat the executives. These were practical men in gray suits. They looked at music through the lens of logistics. To them, a song was a unit of product to be shipped to retailers, and Bohemian Rhapsody was a defective unit. When Roy Thomas Baker played the track for the EMI brass, the reaction was not awe. It was horror. "It's too long," one executive said, shaking his head as the track passed the 5-minute mark. "It's suicide. Radio stations will not play it. The attention span of the average listener is 3 minutes. If you release this, people will switch off halfway through to boil a kettle." They looked at the charts. They looked at the competition. ABBA, the Stylistics, Rod Stewart. Simple, catchy, digestible songs. Then they looked at Queen, who were offering them a 6-minute song about a murderer who meets a clown. The ultimatum was delivered swiftly. "We will release it, but you have to cut the opera section." They proposed a radio edit. They wanted to chop out the middle, glue the ballad to the hard rock section, and bring the running time down to a manageable 3.5 minutes. They wanted to lobotomize the song to make it safe. On the other side of the desk sat Queen and their manager, John Reed. They were desperate, yes. They were broke, yes. But they were also stubborn. "No cuts," Freddie said, his voice quiet but absolute. "It's the whole song or nothing." It was a terrifying gamble. If the single flopped, the album A Night at the Opera, the most expensive album ever made at the time, would likely flop with it. The band would be dropped, their debts would consume them, and Queen would be over. But Freddie Mercury had an ace up his sleeve. He knew that the executives were out of touch. He needed to bypass the gatekeepers and go straight to the people. He needed an insurrection. Enter Kenny Everett. Kenny Everett was a DJ on Capital Radio in London. He was the antithesis of the EMI executives. He was anarchic, flamboyant, funny, and utterly ungovernable. He was also a close personal friend of Freddie Mercury. One weekend in October 1975, Freddie took a reel-to-reel tape of the song to Kenny's house. He played it for him. Kenny listened, his jaw hitting the floor. He knew instantly that this was either a disaster or a masterpiece. "It's fantastic," Kenny said. "I have to play it." Freddie, playing the game of 4D chess, shook his head. No," he insisted, with a theatrical wink. "You absolutely cannot play it. It's not finished. The label would kill me. I just wanted you to hear it." He left the tape with Kenny. He knew exactly what would happen. That weekend, Kenny Everett went on air. He teased his audience. "I have a tape here from Queen," he whispered into the microphone. "I've been told I can't play it. So maybe I'll just play a little bit." He played a snippet. The phones at the radio station lit up. An hour later, he said, "Oops, my finger slipped," and played a bit more. By the end of the weekend, Kenny Everett had played the full, uncut 6-minute version of Bohemian Rhapsody 14 times. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. It wasn't confusion, it was obsession. Listeners flooded the switchboard. They didn't care that it was long. They didn't care that it was weird. They were mesmerized. On Monday morning, record stores across London reported people coming in and demanding to buy a record that hadn't even been released yet. EMI was cornered. The public had bypassed the executives. The demand was real. The radio edit idea was dead in the water. They had no choice but to surrender. On October 31st, 1975, Halloween, a fitting date for such a spooky song, Bohemian Rhapsody was released as a single, uncut, uncensored, unapologetic, but the war wasn't over. The critics were waiting. When the reviews came out, they were savage. The music press hated it. Melody Maker, the Bible of the industry, called it superficial. Sounds magazine said it was pretentious and dated. One critic famously wrote that Queen had slammed their heads against the wall of genius and come away with a headache. They didn't get it. They saw the opera as a joke, a parody. They thought the band was mocking the form. They missed the sincerity underneath the spectacle. But while the critics were sharpening their knives, the song was rocketing up the charts. It hit #1 in the UK, and it stayed there. 1 week, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, and then Queen faced a new problem, a practical problem. They were scheduled to appear on Top of the Pops, the BBC's premier music show. If you were #1, you had to appear. But Queen realized they couldn't possibly perform the song live. The opera section was too complex. They couldn't recreate 180 overdubs on a small TV stage. They would have to mime, and they knew they would look ridiculous standing there mouthing Galileo while a backing track played. So, out of necessity, they invented the modern music video. They called a director named Bruce Gowers. They had a budget of $3,500. They went to a rehearsal stage, set up the lights to mimic the cover of their Queen II album, the famous Floating Heads look, and shot a promotional film. It took 4 hours to shoot. It took 5 hours to edit. They sent the tape to the BBC. The producers of Top of the Pops aired it. It changed the industry overnight. Before Bohemian Rhapsody, music videos were rare oddities. After Bohemian Rhapsody, they were mandatory. Queen proved that you could market a song visually. You could be on television without actually being in the building. The video captured the spooky, dramatic essence of the song perfectly. The image of Freddie's face, shadowed and singing, "Is This the Real Life?" became iconic. By Christmas 1975, Bohemian Rhapsody had been #1 for 9 weeks. It sold over 1 million copies in the UK alone. It saved the band. It paid off the debts. It made them superstars. The gamble had paid off. The label was wrong. The critics were wrong. The radio consultants were wrong. But amidst all the success, amidst the platinum records and the global fame, one question remained. A question that fans, scholars, and psychologists have been asking for 50 years. A question that the architect of the song refused to answer. What on earth is it actually about? The music stopped. The record ended. The cash registers rang. But as the initial shock of the Bohemian Rhapsody phenomenon wore off, a deeper obsession began to take hold of the public imagination. People stopped asking, "How did they make it?" and started asking, "What does it mean?" The lyrics of Bohemian Rhapsody are not a linear story. They are a fever dream. They are a Rorschach test ink blot spilled onto a lyric sheet. For 50 years, fans, scholars, psychologists, and critics have looked into that ink blot and seen their own fears and secrets reflected back at them. There are 3 primary theories that attempt to crack the code of Freddie Mercury's masterpiece. The first theory is the literal interpretation. On the surface, the song reads like a murder ballad. The narrator, a young man, confesses a crime to his mother. "Mama just killed a man, put a gun against his head, pulled my trigger, now he's dead." Through this lens, the song is a retelling of Albert Camus' existentialist novel, The Stranger. It is the story of a man who commits a senseless act of violence and must face the consequences, execution or imprisonment. The opera section is his trial. The rock section is his desperate, angry attempt to escape. The ending is his resignation to his fate. It is a grim, nihilistic tale about the loss of youth and the finality of death. The second theory is the Faustian pact. This theory leans heavily on the specific religious language Freddie used. The song is populated by demons and deities. Scaramouche is a clown who escapes sticky situations. Beelzebub is a biblical name for the devil or a high-ranking demon. Bismillah is the opening phrase of the Quran, meaning "in the name of God." In this reading, the narrator hasn't killed a man. He has sold his soul. The opera section is a metaphysical battleground between the forces of light, "Let him go," and the forces of darkness, "No, we will not let you go." The narrator is trapped in the middle, watching angels and demons fight for his eternal spirit. It is a story of spiritual warfare, terrifying for a man raised in the strict Zoroastrian faith of his parents. But it is the third theory that has gained the most weight in the decades since Freddie Mercury's death. It is the theory that transforms the song from a fantasy into a diary entry. This is the coming out theory. In 1975, Freddie Mercury was a man at war with himself. He was living with Mary Austin, the woman he called the love of his life, but he was secretly beginning to explore his attraction to men. He was a Zoroastrian Parsi immigrant living in a Britain where homosexuality had only been decriminalized 8 years prior. He was a rock star in a hyper-masculine industry. He was trapped between two worlds, unable to fully inhabit either. Through this biographical lens, the lyrics become devastatingly clear. The murder is not literal, it is metaphorical. Mama just killed a man. He hasn't killed a stranger, he has killed his old self. He has killed the image of the straight son, the dutiful Farrokh Bulsara, the man his family expected him to be. The gun is his acknowledgement of his true nature. By accepting who he has destroyed the person he was pretending to be. The opera section becomes a terrifying dramatization of social judgment. I see a little silhouetto of a man. He feels small. He feels shadowed. Scaramouche, Scaramouche, will you do the fandango? The fandango is a dance. Is society asking him to perform, to dance around the truth? The chorus of voices screaming, "No, we will not let you go," represents the forces of judgment, his family, his religion, the conservative press, the music industry. They are demanding he stay in the box. They are demanding he remain the man they want him to be. But another voice, the voice of mercy, screams, "Let him go." It is the internal plea for freedom. The heavy rock section, with its violent thrashing guitar riff, is a flash of pure, white-hot rage. So you think you can stone me and spit in my eye? So you think you can love me and leave me to die? This is Freddie Mercury fighting back. It is a scream of defiance against a world that he knows will reject him, stone him, and shame him if he tells the truth. It is the sound of a man breaking his chains. And then, the resignation. The dust settles, the tempo slows. Nothing really matters. Anyone can see, nothing really matters to me. He accepts his fate. He accepts that he is different. He accepts the monstrosity of his situation. The wind blows, and he is still standing. When Freddie Mercury was alive, he was famously, stubbornly evasive about the song. He refused to give interviewers the key. "It's just rhyming nonsense," he told one journalist, dismissing it with a wave of his hand. "It's mock opera," he told another. "I think people should just listen to it, think about it, and then make up their own minds as to what it says to them," he said, shutting down the inquiry. He refused to explain it for two reasons. First, because he knew that explaining a magic trick ruins the magic. He wanted the listener to find their own meaning. He wanted the song to be universal, not specific. But secondly, and perhaps more importantly, he refused because the truth was too dangerous. In 1975, a rock star standing up and announcing, "This song is about my struggle with homosexuality," would have been career suicide. The culture wasn't ready. The industry wasn't ready. So he hid the truth in plain sight. He wrapped his confession in the safest packaging he could find. Nonsense. He dressed his trauma in the costume of an opera clown so that nobody would suspect it was real. His bandmates protected his secret. They knew. Brian May has since hinted heavily that the song was indeed about Freddie's personal struggles and his breaking out of his old life. But they never confirmed the details while he was alive. They respected the mystery. They respected the mask. The true genius of Bohemian Rhapsody is that it doesn't need to be solved to be felt. A teenager crying in a bedroom in Tokyo doesn't need to know about 17th century clowns or Zoroastrianism to feel the pain in Freddie's voice. A football fan in a stadium doesn't need to know about the technical difficulty of 180 overdubs to bang their head to the riff. The song works because it captures the universal chaos of the human experience. We all feel like we've killed parts of ourselves to survive. We all feel judged by a chorus of voices we can't control. We all want to break free. We all wonder, at 3 a.m., if this is real life or just fantasy. Bohemian Rhapsody is a vessel. Freddie built a cathedral, but he left the pews empty so we could all sit down and pray to whatever god or demon we needed to talk to. The legacy of Bohemian Rhapsody is unparalleled. It is the only song to reach Christmas #1 in the UK twice, once in 1975 and again in 1991 following Freddie's death. It was resurrected for a new generation in 1992 by the movie Wayne's World. The scene of Mike Myers and Dana Carvey headbanging in a beat-up AMC Pacer became one of the most famous moments in comedy history. It proved that the song wasn't just high art. It was fun. It was ridiculous. It was cool. Freddie Mercury saw the scene before he died. He loved it. He laughed. He knew that his masterpiece had survived the transition to a new era. Today, Bohemian Rhapsody is the most streamed classic rock song of all time. It has billions of plays. The biopic named after it won 4 Oscars. But the true miracle isn't the sales figures or the awards. The miracle is that a 6-minute song, written by a gay Parsi immigrant, featuring opera, heavy metal, and nonsense words, became the most beloved song of the 20th century. It is a testament to the fact that the public is smarter than the industry thinks. The suits at EMI thought we had short attention spans. They thought we wanted simple, happy songs. Freddie Mercury knew better. He knew that we are complicated. He knew that we have darkness inside us. He knew that we want to sing along to the tragedy as much as the joy. He bet on his vision. He bet on the opera. And he won. When the final gong crashes and the song fades out, the last words are, "Any way the wind blows." It's a shrug. It's a release. The storm is over. The confession is made. And the wind carries the music forward, past the critics, past the radio bans, past the tragedy of AIDS, and into immortality. Freddie Mercury is gone, but the Rhapsody goes on forever. These are the stories that hide in the grooves of your favorite records. The battles, the secrets, and the genius that make the music matter. If you want to keep exploring the history of rock and roll with us, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We have so many more masterpieces to decode.